Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Richard H. Thaler, who is the Ralph and Dorothy Keller Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics at the Graduate School of Business, the University of Chicago. His publications include The Winner's Curse, Paradoxes and Anomalies of Economic Life, and Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. He is the 2010 Hitchcock Professor on the Berkeley campus. Well, welcome, Professor Thaler.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here in Berkeley.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in New Jersey, and grew up in suburban New Jersey. My father was an actuary and commuted on the train into Newark, worked at Prudential.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Oh, it's always hard to tell. I think my father's greatest influence on me probably was to convince me that I didn't have it in me to become a businessman. I saw what he did and I knew I couldn't do that. And so I've never held an honest job and hope to keep it that way.
But did he pique your interest in economics?
Not really. I would say he piqued my interest in math. Actuaries are really applied mathematicians, and he was always giving me little brain teasers and math problems, and I'd say he cultivated my analytical thinking ability.
And where were you educated?
I was an undergraduate at Case Western Reserve and did my PhD at the University of Rochester.
And what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on the value of a life. And it sounds like an unusual topic, but I had taught a course in cost-benefit analysis. And this was kind of a problem that hadn't really been dealt with satisfactorily. How should we decide how much to spend on making things safer? And so the theoretically correct approach is to see how much you would be willing to pay to make your life a little bit safer. And then, because that's what we do, we don't save specific lives. We make everyone's lives a little bit safer. And so I estimated that by looking at how much you had to pay people to get them to take risky jobs. Mm-hmm. And it was a very classical economics thesis.
And you are classified, I guess, as a behavioral economist.
Yes.
And I want to help our audience understand what that exactly means. And I want to help students understand how you prepare for a career in behavioral economics. So first let me ask, what are the skills involved in the kind of work you do?
Well, being a behavioral economist is really being an economist. And the training is really 90% the same as being any other kind of economist. I think it's just taking a somewhat different approach and borrowing some psychology. So a student who sets out to become a behavioral economist goes to an economics graduate program and then takes some psychology courses to add some breadth.
Mm-hmm. And what accounts for your interest in human behavior and psychology as a way to inform economics? Was it the anomalies of economic theory that led you in that direction, or was this just an interest you developed earlier in your career?
No, I just kept running into counterexamples to the theory. So the first one I found while I was working on my thesis. So I decided, I mentioned I was doing really an econometrics exercise, but I decided just for the fun of it to ask people some questions. So I would ask people two questions. Suppose by conducting this interview, you've been exposed to a 1 in 1,000 risk of death. How much would you pay to eliminate it? And then I'd ask a second question. how much would you have to be paid to agree to accept an extra 1 in 1,000 risk of death? Now, economic theory says those answers have to be virtually the same. But when I would ask those questions, people would say, oh, I would pay $5,000 to eliminate the risk, but you wouldn't get me to take that risk for $1 million. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And so I started having a list on my blackboard of funny behavior. And I was trying to make sense of this behavior. And then I ran into the work of two psychologists, two Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman, of course, was a faculty member at Berkeley here for many years.
And he was a guest on our program, actually.
And so they had planned a trip to Stanford for a year. They were professors at the Hebrew University, and they were going to go to Stanford for a year, 1977, and I made it my business to be in Stanford that year too. We spent a year talking, and the rest is history.
Now, in your book on the winner's curse, you help us understand what a theory is in economics. I want to talk a little about that. What is a theory, and then what is the driving theory of economics, if there is one? What is its assumptions about the way people act in the marketplace?
Well, the first and most important hypothesis is that agents optimize, individuals or firms. So firms maximize the value of the firm, consumers maximize utility. They solve any problem as well as an economist would. And in fact, the sort of culture of economics is that suppose you write down some theory of, well, the recent Nobel Prize winners won research for search behavior. So suppose Peter Diamond writes down a model of search behavior, and then I come along and I write down a model of search behavior where the agents are more clever in the way they search. Then my model is taken to be better than Peter's model. Now, it's not that it's a better description. We've evolved that the agents in the economy, as assumed by economists, have been getting smarter and smarter for the last 60 years. But human beings are, just as dumb as we always were, just as human. So we've had this growing gap, and I'm trying to fill in that gap by studying humans in economic situations as opposed to what in Nudge, Cass Sunstein and I call them econs, which are these mythical creatures that populate economics textbooks.
Now, in a theory, and we'll talk about your insights in a minute in terms of the flaws of human nature that enter into the equation, but in a theory, the goal is to simplify,
Right.
to push away all of the brush and to have, I guess elegant is the word, a statement with few assumptions, and then the measure of success is whether you generally predict the way things actually happen in the real world?
Well, but notice there's a bit of a conflict there between elegance and predictive power. So, Einstein said elegance is for tailors. And that we want a theory to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so economic theory is elegant and simple and wrong. Now, so let me give you an example. one of the unstated assumptions of economics is that people have perfect self-control because they choose just what they should choose. So an econ never has a hangover, never needs to go on a diet because he eats just the right amount. And, you know, saves for retirement perfectly. Now, we look around and 20% of America is obese and 40% is overweight. That doesn't look like a world in which people have perfect self-control. Now, an economist, of course, could say, well, they choose to be obese. They choose to be overweight. But there's a whole industry helping people go on diets, which suggests that, no, it's not that people are choosing to be fat. There's a conflict there. One part of them would like to be thinner. Another part of them reaches for the bag of potato chips. And so if we're going to have a good model of that conflict, we have to face it head on.
So in your work, as you got into this, it was the situation that you would run up against anomalies that the theory couldn't account for. So your book is called The Winner's Curse. What is the winner's curse, and what did you learn from that?
Well, the winner's curse is kind of a well-known phenomena in economics, in which the more bidders there are for some object, an object that's worth the same to everybody, like, say, an oil well, the more bidders there are, the more likely it is that the winner pays too much. And so this has been well documented in things like studies of bidding for oil wells or for baseball players. When the Yankees paid so much money to get Alex Rodriguez, or well, originally the Rangers, he was a very good player, but they paid him an astronomical amount, and he probably wasn't worth the astronomical amount. So the more bidders there are, the more careful you want to be in bidding, but that's a very counterintuitive idea. And so in many contexts, we see people bid too much, and then the winner's curse is the fact that when you win the auction, you should be unhappy rather than happy.
Now, the thrust of behavioral economics is empowered by observation, and I'm a little confused as how does theory, classical theory, continue to survive when it really doesn't emphasize observation in the way behavioral economists do? Or am I missing something here?
Well, I think, you know, the geocentric models of the universe survived for hundreds of years with epicycles. So, you know, epicycles were the kludges that were invented by defenders of the geocentric model to explain the anomalies. And as they got better, you know, as they invented telescopes and things, the anomalies became more and more clear, and the epicycles became more and more convoluted. So the defenders of the classical economic theory say, well, it's the only theory we have. And what's true is it is very elegant and parsimonious, and it often makes good predictions. So it is the case, of course, that people respond to incentives. If you raise the price, people buy less. That's a pretty good prediction. Now, do they do things perfectly? No. And we can argue about what are the situations in which these departures are most important. And my strategy has been to aim at those. So I've spent a lot of time talking about self-control problems because I think those are glaring examples in which the standard model fails. I've also studied situations in economic theory assumes that people are selfish. And so if there's some way of taking advantage of you, I will, if I'm a good economic agent. Humans are a little nicer than that. If you ask somebody what time it is, most people, they just look at their watch and respond truthfully. They don't think, oh, maybe this is a strategic opportunity. And, you know, if I tell you it's 5 minutes later, then I'll get a better seat in the movie theater. You know, I think we behavioral economists have not abandoned the standard model. What we've done is append things to it to make it more realistic. And the reason is there will not be one single parsimonious behavioral model, any more than there's a single parsimonious model of psychology or political science or international relations. Alas, there is no such model.
And so the world, when you get into the world of behavior in the way you do it, it's messier, and so therefore your goal is really not to come up with a new theory so much as really to enhance, inform, and show the errors of economic theory. Is that
no? I mean, there are. I'm not. I don't practice what economists generally would call economic theory, and but many of my colleagues, several of my colleagues here at Berkeley, Matthew Rabin, Matthew Botan, Stefano Della Vigna, do engage precisely in standard-looking economic theory, lots of mathematical models that are departures from the standard theory. So it is possible to write down mathematically rigorous economic theory that's behaviorally enlightened. What's true is that the model we have that explains why we seem to lack self-control might be a different one than the model that we have that explains why, if you're nice to me, I'm probably going to be nice to you.
And I want to be clear about something. If one were to look at your career and the insights you brought to the table, is what has propelled you the anomalies that you wound up collecting, so that you were it was through observation, or was there some philosophical reason for your working in this direction? By that I mean, hey, people are nicer than what economic the way economic theory posits they are.
No, I don't think there was some philosophical motivation. I think it was, I was, you know, Milton Friedman used to, he had a book on that he called Positive Economics. And he used to say, in defending the rational model actually, that we should judge a theory by its predictive power, not by its assumptions. So that's the way he defended the seemingly artificiality of the assumptions. And my approach has been to say, okay, Milt, let's do that, but look, here, and here, the model fails. And so I think what's driven me over the years it was first that list of anomalies, and then second, the challenge of convincing my colleagues that these were worth taking seriously.
Okay, so why don't we move on to something else, and let's talk about where this leads us and what you're trying to accomplish in your book on nudging, because the behavioral model essentially leads to a set of conclusions about human behavior, but then from that you draw implications about what policy, how behavioral economics might influence policy. So let's talk about that. You call yourself a libertarian paternalist. What is that, and what does it tell you about the way you look at public policy?
So obviously the phrase sounds like an oxymoron. And it was kind of meant to be a poke in the eye. But by libertarian, we mean we like to devise policies that respect freedom of choice and don't tell anybody what they have to do. By paternalism, we simply mean helping people achieve their own goals as defined by themselves. So suppose when we walk out of the studio, somebody comes up to you and says, "Can you direct me toward Telegraph Avenue?" If you're the sort of person that points them in the correct direction, then you're a paternalist. If you give them directions that may not be the actual most direct route, but the route that they're least likely to make a mistake, you also qualify as a paternalist. But this is a new kind of paternalism that doesn't require coercion. It's not a nanny state. It doesn't say, you shouldn't eat fatty food. It says, if you'd like to lose weight, here's an environment that might help you. So that's our goal, is to create a new sort of political framework. And our goal was to create one that was neither left nor right. So it has the libertarian flavor that some on the right seem to endorse, and it has the caring about people that many progressivists endorse. It's not that different from compassionate conservatism, a phrase that from our distant past.
And what are there categories of help us organize the way people fail in seeing their best interests? Because what you and your co-author go through is a list of kind of human failings that sort of are the foundation upon which you build your model. Are there characteristics of all of these things? Are there certain kind of general situations where these failings manifest themselves?
Well, we've talked about self-control. So that's one problem we humans face. So many of us eat too much, drink too much, smoke too much, fail to save for retirement. And people admit to that. If you ask people, there have been surveys conducted of participants in 401k plans, and you say, do you think you're saving too much, just the right amount, or too little? 2/3 will say too little. Now, an economist will make fun of that and say, well, if they think they're saving too little, then why aren't they saving more? And the answer, if you ask people that, they'll say, well, I can't afford it. Okay, so how can we, that seems to be an opportunity. If you have somebody who's tried to quit smoking 4 times and has failed, well, you have an opportunity. If you can come up with a better nicotine patch, then you're able to help people achieve their own goals. So one of the success stories of behavioral economics is a program a colleague, a former student of mine, Shlomo Ben-Artzi, and I devised to help people save more. We call it Save More Tomorrow. And it's based on the premise that all of us have more self-control in the future than we do now. So many of us are planning diets next month. And so what we do is give people an opportunity to commit themselves to saving more later when they can afford it. And we also link it to raises because we know people display what we call loss aversion. They hate losing. They don't like to see their pay go down. So we allow people to sign up for a plan where every time they get a raise, they increase the amount that they're contributing to the savings plan by a little bit in a way they don't even notice. Mm-hmm. The first company that adopted this, we tripled saving rates in 2.5 years. Nobody complained. People signed up for it. They were happy. Now, according to economic theory, our plan wouldn't have worked. No one would have signed up because they were already saving just the right amount. What do they need this for? And so that's an example, a perfect example of a nudge, and a successful nudge. And, for years, people had struggled about the right tax incentives to get people to save. And this is going to sound totally banal and obvious when I say it, but it's a point that most economists have missed. And it's the basic lesson from social psychology. If you want to encourage people to do something, make it easier for them to do it. Full stop. And if you do that, wonders will happen.
And it sounds like in this example you're giving that you're sort of realizing or you're accepting the reality that people are contradictory. They have the best intentions for the future, but in the short term they may not act on them. And then you're essentially finding the beauty in the default position, really, that you're essentially saying, okay, let's do something in the future that you do right now so it happens automatic. It becomes the default position. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we let inertia work its magic. Because people can withdraw from the system anytime. But, we lose 2 or 3% a year. So, because they don't bother to pull out of the system. So we always put a cap. I sometimes joke I could get people saving 150% of their income if this worked long enough. They wonder, geez, how come I have to write a check to Berkeley every month? And I'm joking, but the point is that inertia creates big problems. We get stuck in ruts, but then we can use inertia. So one of our most powerful tools in nudge is precisely the power of the default option. And default options are simply what happens if you do nothing. Mm-hmm. So when you get a new computer, there are all sorts of options that have been picked by the manufacturer. How long it takes for the screensaver to come on if you do nothing. What is the screensaver? Well, if you're like me, you never changed any of those options. So the computer manufacturer has a lot of power, and they can use that to help you or to abuse you. It can be an option that you've automatically checked to get emails once a week from the manufacturer trying to sell you other things. You would prefer that box not be checked. But if you have to dig down far enough to uncheck it, chances are you won't.
Now, there's a political problem here, and it would seem to lead to resistance to what you're saying. That is, some actors in the market, for example, use human weakness and human frailty to actually take advantage of the consumer. Whereas what you're saying is, let's look at the greater good here, and without interfering with people's decision, let them see, help them act on the basis of the bigger picture. What about that problem of the people? One thinks here of the whole mortgage industry,
Right.
where a lot of
That's exactly
things,
where I was going to go.
yeah.
So if you think about the crisis we're still living through, much of it was started with people taking out mortgages that weren't good for them. Many of those were sold door to door in the old-fashioned high-pressure sales technique. Psst, buddy, I can get you a good deal on a mortgage. And in quite deceptive ways. Now, you can say they're nudging. We didn't invent nudging. It's been around for thousands of years. So, well, what can we do about that? In a sense, this is my co-author's job.
Your co-author, tell our audience who your
My co-author is Cass Sunstein, a world-renowned constitutional lawyer whose current job is, in the media they call him the regulation czar. His official title is the director of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, part of the OMB. And his job is to make sure that new regulations adopted by the government do more good than harm. And so he might think about, okay, what are we going to do about mortgages? Now, we know there's just been a new Consumer Financial Protection Agency created, and Elizabeth Warren, another law professor, has been given the job of figuring out what that agency will do. And certainly I would encourage Cass and Elizabeth to think about the mortgage market as how can we help people who are choosing mortgages make fewer blunders without going so far as to say, you must take this kind of mortgage, you must not take that. And one of the things that we advocate in the book and that I've been continuing to work on and advocate for is a new kind of disclosure, electronic disclosure. And let me explain what that means. When you get a mortgage, you get 30 pages of forms that you have to sign, and you're signing something that says, I've read this thing, and anyone who's ever bought a house knows you go to a closing and you spend an hour signing pieces of paper that you don't read. Now, so that disclosure is useless. And there's always ways that we're going to have plain English disclosure. Plain English disclosure for really complicated products is a hopeless task. I don't need a plain English disclosure for how my iPhone works, because it's obvious how it works. I press the button and it works. So, but no one can explain to me the complexities of that mortgage. So here's what we advocate. When you apply for a mortgage, you would get an electronic file instead of 30 pages. Now, it's not that you'd look at that file. You would, with one click, upload it to a website, a private website, that would help explain it to you. And what we'd like is mortgage shopping to be as easy as airline shopping. So we're all pretty good now at finding the best fare between San Francisco and Chicago, because there's a whole array of websites that makes it easy for us to do that. There are even websites that search across the other websites. So I think that market works pretty well, and it's because the airfares are readily available. We want to make everything readily available. The Obama administration has been extremely aggressive in releasing data, and so has the Bay Area. One of the best things the local government has done is BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, has GPS locators in every train and bus. They just released that data that they already had, where every train and bus is, and then third-party providers created apps. So if you're standing at a bus stop wondering where the bus is, you can look in your app and say it's actually caught in a traffic jam. It's 4 blocks down, it's never going to get to you. So that cost the government nothing. They just released the data. The market provides the fancy app. And so the administration is busy releasing all kinds of data that was hidden in file cabinets and will let the market do its wonders.
Now, what can be done about the resistance let's go back to the case of mortgages, where there is something of a fight to do the simple things that might make things better. In your book, you propose, with regard to credit cards, the notion of a recap. End of the year,
Right.
a very simple statement. This is how much interest you're paying. This is what your account looks like, which would allow you to do shopping around to see, well, do I really want this credit card? How do we win the battle of making that happen? The insight is the right one, but is there a resistance to having that happen?
Well, I think some players in the market will resist this. Regulators often get captured by the industry. We've set up a new regulator, and I'm sure that the president and Ms. Warren have every intention not to be captured, but they will be under pressure. I think that this electronic disclosure and recap is a middle course. So not every provider may embrace it, but I think the honest ones will. The big players will. And so I have some hope that if the companies are to choose between a regulator telling them they can't charge this sort of fee, but they can charge that sort of fee, in which they play this endless game of whack-a-mole, where the regulator abolishes some fee and they invent some new one, that if we just go to disclosure, then I think that the honest firms will win. And I make a pitch whenever I speak to groups like that this is the sort of regulation that you should want, because it just creates good competition. And if you're in the business of trying to fool people, then by all means you should oppose this.
Let's look now at the economic collapse of 2008, and is there some way of looking at that crisis that is especially informed by behavioral economics?
Well, one of the behavioral problems we haven't talked about yet, and it's one of the most important, is overconfidence. So, the first week I teach a course in decision making at the Chicago Booth School of Business, and before the class even starts, we have the students fill out a survey on the web, and one of the questions is, where in the grade distribution do you think you'll come out? And 90% of the class thinks they'll be above the median. Now, of course, that can't happen. And slowly, during the course of the quarter, they realized that that prediction was overconfident. Well, business people are overconfident too. And, Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, said the risk of that oil well exploding was 1 in a million. And I think the CEOs of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers never thought this could happen to them. And so I think there were lots of human failings. Part of it came from complexity, that they were dealing with ever increasingly complex mechanisms, be it a black box trading system or an oil well that's a mile down. And the CEOs didn't really understand what some of their bright employees were doing. And here's where I think my plea for more disclosure may have a hidden benefit. I think in some cases, firms will end up disclosing things to themselves. So going back to the government's disclosure, one of the things the Obama administration did in their first few months was release on CD-ROM a record of the details of every 401k plan in the country. Now, there's a company down in Southern California that rates 401k plans. They could, now that they got this data, they could rate every company. They've told me that some CEOs have called them up and said, we got a 68 on your score. We had no idea our plan was so bad, we're going to fix it. So that's disclosure to yourself. It's like getting on the scale. And if you're forced to get on the scale, maybe you'll be nudged to go on a diet.
So it's interesting because what you're saying is that with the insights of behavioral economics, you're able to push the system in positive directions just by looking at the individual, the organization, the CEO, the consumer, and saying, if you knew more, if you had better information, better feedback, and systems that sort of transcended human frailty, that you would actually not be undoing the market, but making it better.
Exactly. We're pro-market. But we'd like to create, markets work best for simple products. If you go to the farmer's market and there are 8 vendors selling heirloom tomatoes, you know, you can do a pretty good job of picking the best tomatoes at the price you want to pay. You know, if you're picking a mortgage, most PhDs in finance struggle with understanding all the terms of a mortgage. So that market isn't going to work as well as the farmer's market. And we want to make everything work as well as the example I gave before of picking an airline ticket. That has become pretty easy, even though the pricing strategies are very complicated. Right? I have no idea why the flight at 10 a.m. costs half as much as the flight at 4 p.m. I don't know what the formula is, but I can see it there and I can decide whether I have the flexibility to fly at 10 and I can save $400.
Now, what does this tell us about the way we should act in the future with regard to regulation? Is it just what you said, namely more information at our fingertips, or what else? I mean, because there are people who want to exploit the system, you know, that actually were sort of party to the making of the crisis.
Well, I think we want to put a spotlight on them. I think the danger here is, and people often accuse me of thinking that we want lots of heavy-handed regulation. And they accuse me of not realizing that bureaucrats are humans too. So let me say right here in front of the camera that I understand bureaucrats, with the possible exception of my co-author, are fallible. And, you know, I write a monthly column in the New York Times, and I wrote one on World Cup refereeing, precisely to make this point. In the recent World Cup, there was an incident in which England was playing Germany and a ball went 1 yard into the goal and everyone missed it. And there were thousands of replays where you see the ball landing a yard over the goal line and everyone missing it. And the thrust of my essay was, if you were designing the rules, the first thing you would take into account that the referee is fallible. He can only be in one place at a time. He can only see in one direction. So we need to create rules that take into account that everyone's fallible. Larry Summers said something very smart about the new financial regulations. And he said, the goal should be to create regulations that don't require anyone to get any smarter. And by that he meant both the consumers and the regulators. So that's my goal, is to create a world where we don't need to be geniuses to pick a mortgage, and we don't need to be geniuses to run the Consumer Finance Protection Agency.
And what sort of politics make that possible? Because your book has been attacked, I assume, by some people who view you, a person who only wants to nudge, as a socialist, basically.
Yeah, that's quite funny because, well, Glenn Beck in particular thinks that we have some evil agenda. He's referred to my co-author as the most dangerous man in America, which I can assure you he's not. There certainly must be someone more dangerous than him. And I would nominate him actually as one of the least dangerous men in America. If he has a flaw, it's moderate. He's too moderate. But you know, the irony is that the new government in the UK that's led by the Conservative Party has set up a nudge unit in Number 10. Informally, it's called the Nudge Unit. The formal name for it is the Behavioral Insight Team. And I'm an advisor to that team, and our mandate is to just think of ways that we can improve what government does using behavioral science techniques. So I don't think that this is a left versus right. I'm just back from a trip to Korea where the president of Korea read the book and assigned it to his cabinet. And he is from an extremely conservative party, former businessman. So we set out to write a book that was neither left nor right. And to some extent we've achieved, but there's, with a few exceptions.
If students were watching this interview, they want to go into economics, public policy, how would you advise them to prepare for a career so that they're able to take advantage of psychology and the kind of analysis that you're doing while remaining in economics?
Well, you mean aside from reading our book cover to cover,
right, and,
several times,
and making it available to all their students,
yes,
as they
assigning.
Yes.
I think that's one of the. I've been on a campaign to replace the Bible in hotel rooms with copies of Nudge, Gideon's Nudge, I think.
Yeah.
But you know, I think that many leading public policy schools are starting to incorporate psychology courses in their curriculum. And I think that makes really great sense. And it's not all economics. It's very important that policymakers understand economics, but what we're trying to convince them of is that it's just as important that they have some understanding of human nature.
And that, I think you're saying that comes from observation and not necessarily coursework.
No, I think I've learned a tremendous amount from reading the work of psychologists like Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And I teach a course that's more psychology than economics. And I think there should be a course like that in every public policy program.
Well, on that note, Professor Thaler, I want to thank you for being on our program, and I'm going to show your book because everybody is going to want to go out and buy it.
Right. Christmas is coming up. You know, this is a perfect Christmas gift.
Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.